Dan Rubenstein, we have a deal to report.
Oh my God, what is it? Are we going somewhere? Do we have a new deal? What are we doing?
We don't have a deal. I wish we had it. We do not have a new deal to report, at least not at this juncture. Ooh. But the ACC does. The ACC does. So we've been talking about this now on our show for what feels like forever. It's been at least 2 years. Florida State, perpetually unhappy in the ACC, has clearly been kicking the tires to see what's out there. There have been lawsuits filed, testing the waters, seeing what the grant of rights will or won't allow them to do as an entity. Could they leave? Might they pay an exorbitant sum? If you've listened to us, you know that we've talked about this ad nauseum. Clemson sort of followed suit, though not quite as aggressively. There have been rumblings about other schools like North Carolina. What about Miami, et cetera, et cetera? The ACC has been on unstable ground now for a while. Right. We're going to bring David Hale from ESPN.com on here shortly to talk through exactly what the terms of this new deal look like. It seems like for some period of time, we're going to have some stability in the ACC, which I guess is a good thing. Yeah.
Well, it's a good thing if you're the ACC. It's a good thing if you are some of the teams that are perceived to be not as valuable as others as TV properties, I guess. And this is not unique to the ACC after we've been through a round of realignment involving size of local markets as it relates to a Big Ten network footprint, as it relates to TV ratings, as it relates to streaming, as it relates to whatever. Nothing new, nothing unique to the ACC, but it is kind of wild to think about how this is all being positioned, that you get bonuses for, I think it's a 5-year rolling average of TV ratings. So it's going to be unequal revenue sharing, not exclusively for Florida State or Clemson, but exclusively for teams who perform on television like Florida State and Clemson generally do.
Right.
Right. And so even though neither one of those teams, I don't believe, were the highest rated ACC teams last year, that was Georgia Tech, and that's sort of a matter of circumstance, and Georgia Tech was pretty good last year. So they were playing in fun, entertaining games against interesting teams. It is kind of a fascinating stay of decision making, as you know, the Florida State and Clemson are trading financial flexibility down the road for staying in for now and giving the ACC some semblance of time to figure things out ahead of the early 2030s when college football is going to be thrown into a blender once again.
You're borrowing my term. I love it. And you're absolutely right. Yeah. 2030, 2031, 2032. That will be, I think, the next window when things go haywire. In the interim, though,
yes,
why don't we bring David on? David knows a lot more about this than you and I. If you're new here, if you're just passing by, hit follow, hit subscribe so that you don't miss any of our episodes. 2 episodes per week in the off season, Tuesday, Thursday. We also do bonus stuff out on our Patreon at verballers.com, VERBALLERS.com. So like bonus content and ad-free episodes. Got a big old Discord server where people are always talking about college football, among many other things. Go and check that out. Again, that's at verballers.com. All right, Dan, to help us sort all of this out, pleased to welcome, I believe for the first time to the show, David Hale from ESPN.com. Sir, David, welcome. It's great to have you.
I'm thrilled to be here. I wore a sport coat and a button down so that my opinions would be taken more seriously.
Yeah, you're adhering to the rigorous dress code that we employ for all of our guests. Yeah.
So we reached out to you earlier today to see if you had a window to hop on with us. Thankfully, you did. And Dan made a joke about us being basically 11-year-olds trying to understand what transpired here with the ACC. So with that as the framework, can you explain this to us from a high level as if we were 11-year-olds? What is going on here with the ACC?
Yeah, so guys, sometimes when a mommy and a daddy in a conference love each other very much, they share this sort of special hug. It's called a lawsuit. Let's see if I can dumb this down as best I can. The ACC has a TV deal that runs through 2036. And that TV deal by Florida State and Clemson and a few others who didn't file lawsuits way of looking at things was not very amenable to their financial needs. And so they wanted out. And so they filed a lawsuit against the ACC, each of them. The ACC countersued, that basically was designed to determine what a grant of rights really means. How much will it hold up in court? And a grant of rights is basically each individual school signs over their TV rights to the conference, and the conference negotiates for all schools at once. So the idea that Florida State and Clemson could leave, they could leave anytime they wanted. They pay a penalty to leave, but they couldn't bring their media rights with them. And nobody's going to want you if your games can't be on TV. So that's what the lawsuits were about. Well, the problem is a handful of real issues came up. One, the ACC is just getting battered in public relations and spending millions in court costs, and no one knew what the future was going to hold. So there's a lot of sort of hand-wringing and impatience among ACC membership. There was no clear offer from the SEC or Big Ten for Clemson or FSU to go join them, certainly not at a full share level the way that Texas and Oklahoma got. And we're now 14-ish months into the first lawsuit, which Florida State and the ACC filed against each other in two separate jurisdictions, one in Charlotte, one in Leon County, Florida. And we've gotten nowhere. There's not been actual legal arguments. There's been briefs filed. They've argued about venue, but nothing substantive has happened. So all of this sort of coalesced in this idea of maybe we should all find a way to get along. And so over the last better part of 14 months, there has been on again and off again conversations about, is there a way to make Florida State and Clemson want to stay? And as it turned out, the way that the ACC found was to just give them everything they wanted. Turns out that solved all the problems. So what's going to happen with this settlement that has been approved by all parties now is they will redistribute their TV money based on TV ratings in part. So 40% of the old money just stays being given out equally. 60% goes into this bucket that's going to be distributed via ratings, which one would assume are going to benefit Florida State and Clemson and some of the other biggest names. Now, they 2 years ago approved this thing called success initiatives, which is if you make the postseason, you get more money. And Florida State assumed that would help them too, and then they went 2-10. So that wasn't as helpful as they thought it was going to be. But in theory, here the money will allow Florida State, Clemson, and maybe some others to mostly catch up with the SEC and Big Ten. And then more importantly, they basically said that grant of rights that we've been arguing about, forget it, don't matter. And so what'll happen is there's still an exit fee, which currently is 3 times annual operating revenue, somewhere in the $160 million range. It will go down $18 million a year, every year until 2030, at which point it'll be $75 million from there on out. So in 2030, FSU and Clemson can write over a check for $75 million, which in the grand scheme of things, find it in your couch cushions. They write that and they can go off on their merry way with their TV rights, join any conference they want. And the reason 2031 is such an important date is it is the same time that college football playoffs next 6-year iteration comes up. The Big 12 media rights come up, and the Big 10 media rights come up, and the SEC's right after that too. So I think everybody sort of views that window as this inflection point of college sports in which good Lord knows what's going to happen after that. But having some flexibility for Clemson and Florida State, and I'll point out, school like North Carolina, where I'm at today, they didn't file any lawsuits. They had much fewer legal expenses, and they're going to get all of the same benefits that Florida State and Clemson are getting. So those schools have the ability to maneuver when the world gets shaken up again, as it inevitably will. Is that a dumb enough answer for you?
That was great.
Perfect.
No notes, 10 out of 10. That is a good top level look at this. My question now is, and you primarily or largely or whatever the word is, you cover the ACC, you've covered the ACC on a level where you don't necessarily cover the rest of the sport, but obviously you are looking at this as a national person as well. My question to you is, do people from the outside, do people in the Big Ten, do schools in the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, wherever, are they looking at something like this as a precedent to do something similar where you're going to say, well, look, everybody's watching Colorado games in the Big 12. Why is Colorado making the same amount? Everybody's watching Oregon or Ohio State or Alabama or LSU. Why is Kentucky or Indiana making the same amount? Is this seen in that way, or is this seen as sort of a one-off special ACC thing temporarily?
I think it could go either way. And I have talked to folks both inside and outside the ACC who think this is a potentially precedent-setting progressive is the word that I keep hearing, way of distributing money. Now, I think that can work both ways. Look, the Big 12 used to distribute money unevenly because Texas said, gimme, gimme, gimme. And Texas, the last time I checked, is in the SEC now. So I don't know that any of this in the grand scheme of things makes a lot of sense. But I do know another thing that doesn't make any sense is that Vanderbilt gets the same TV money as Alabama, and Northwestern gets the same TV money as Ohio State. And I think there's a lot of people who look at that and say that's ridiculous. And it would seem like only a matter of time until Ohio State and Alabama say that's ridiculous. Now, could we move in a direction like this where ratings impact how much you get paid? I think certainly there's going to be a template here, and we'll see how it works for the ACC. And I'm sure people are happy to let the ACC be the canary in the coal mine on this. I also think that there's a chance that we end up more in like an NFL model where actually they just boot all of the schools that they're not interested in to the curb. We create super leagues or a super league or something like that. And we've got 40 teams playing at that level. And the difference between number 1 and number 40 isn't enough to warrant like nickel and diming everybody. And they distribute their rights to multiple different TV networks, and it looks a lot like the NFL. I think that's certainly a possibility too. The reason that the ACC is doing this and the reason it makes sense for maybe the Big 12 or a Group of 5 conference is because there's scarcity of resources. And so, Boston College, God bless them, is not trying to win a national championship every year. Florida State and Clemson are. And so put your resources in the schools that are trying to win at the highest level, and Boston College will still be able to fund a national championship women's lacrosse team, and that'll be great for them, and they'll be pleased about it. And they probably would like to do a little bit better in a Bean Cup, but these things happen. So how many other leagues are going to follow suit? I think a lot of it depends on what the economics of college football look like in 5 years.
Is there any leverage that supposedly smaller or lesser schools in the ACC or any other conference, as you see it now? Because we love and cherish a sport that has nothing but unintended consequences anytime anybody makes a decision. So is the best thing that any of these schools has on their side the public? That nobody truly wants a super league, but everybody kind of feels like this is where we're going. And maybe I'm wrong in that assertion, but it feels like it's not that millions upon millions of people want to watch Northwestern football or Wake Forest football, but you're losing essentially what the appeal of the sport seems to be. Is that at all powerful in this, or does it not fully matter to those who are making these decisions?
Yeah, I think it certainly can be. I mean, you look at when the information gets out about the SEC and Big Ten wanting to have automatic bids to the next iteration of the playoff, the public backlash to that was huge. Not just, and I will say, not just among like ACC or Big 12 fans. SEC fans didn't like it.
No,
a lot. Like I was on Feinbaum, and his callers are just yelling about how unfair and ridiculous this is. So
it's anti-competitive.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think there is a level of public backlash that would get through to people. I think there's also the courts are a big thing. So one of the things that I've heard a lot as we've talked about the future of college sports is a comparison to European soccer. And if you look at sort of the history of the EPL and how that got formed, a lot of the economics and legalese of it and the way that the biggest brands sort of banded together to come up with their own idea, it looks a lot like what's happening now in college football. But the British court said that violates antitrust. And so that's why you have promotion and relegation there. And the public backlash against super leagues in Europe was enough to kill it temporarily, at least. So I think some of those same things apply here, and it wouldn't shock me if those things happen. But I also think at the end of the day, the dollars are what tell the story. And if there's more money to be had, the people who want that money are going to do what it takes to get that money.
As compared to the EPL, the metric that they're using to weight some additional revenue, spread it out among some of the bigger schools, it's not where you finish in the league table. It's TV ratings. Does anything speak to the state of the sport right now more than using TV ratings to determine who gets what?
And I'll be honest with you, the amount of like infighting on this is ridiculous. So and I'm still not clear on some of the details of how all of this is actually going to work in practice, because there was argument over exactly, they're going to use 5-year TV windows, which I think is really good for somebody like Florida State or Clemson, because that average isn't good. It changes year to year, but it mostly stays the same over a long period of time. but like a school like Georgia Tech had the highest ratings of any ACC team last year. And the reason for that is they played a week 0 against Florida State when there's nothing else on, and a Friday night, a week 14 game against Georgia that went 7 overtimes that everybody was watching. I love Georgia Tech and Haynes King's fun, but they weren't the reason that those ratings were what they were. But they'd love a 1-year window because it's great for them. Florida State would say, well, that last year was not great for us. We want a 10-year window, go back further. So that's a little bit, but like I talked to Louisville's athletics director and he's like, we played Notre Dame last year, which would have been a boon for our ratings, except NBC put it on Peacock and you had to have a subscription to watch it. The ratings for that are going to suck. Like, how does that hurts us? Or what if you're on ACC network 3 times a year? That's not even a rated network, which I have a show on there, and I know it's not a rated network, thankfully, because I don't want to know what those numbers look like. I mean, there's a lot that goes into this that makes it ridiculous, and I think the long and short of it is, it was a system that appealed to Clemson and Florida State, so it got done.
Right. I watched a conversation you had with, I think it was Andrea Adelson, out on ESPN.com. It was posted out there, and you mentioned that, look, this wasn't a perfect deal. That's not how deals work. Everybody's got to compromise a little bit. What exactly did Florida State and Clemson compromise on? Because it seems pretty perfect for them, no?
Yeah, no, you're not wrong. I think they would have, in a perfect world, they got out last year and joined the SEC, and they're making $70 million a year right now. That was what would have been a perfect world. And if I'm reading the message boards at Florida State correctly, that actually happened, and we're just biased for not talking about it, I think. But I mean, the truth of it is they got almost everything they wanted. It's funny, I've asked a few administrators at some of the smaller schools who are clearly not going to benefit from this, like, what did you get out of this? And the overwhelming answer was fewer headaches for the next 5 years. And 5 years from now, who the hell knows what all of this is going to look like? So why endure 5 years of misery to get to a point where it's just going to be a new type of misery after that? I think everybody kind of thought, like, if Clemson and FSU want out, by 2030, they're going to find their way out one way or another. So let's have some peace between now and then. I think it was, I got a 6 and a 7-year-old, and they just wear me down. Like, I know I'm right, and I start out saying I'm not going to give in, but eventually they have more energy than I do, and so I give in. And I think that is largely what happened here.
Is there any element of 5 years is an eternity in this industry, and both in terms of jobs and in terms of the status of the sport? Like, is Jim Phillips going to be the commissioner? Is ESPN going to be run by the same people? Are the trustees at Florida State going to be the same? It definitely feels like literally any other industry where decisions are made because when the next decision needs to be made, it's likely going to be somebody else's problem.
I think there is a huge aspect of that, of the next guy can figure this out. Okay, it's sort of like when you order that 12th shot of Jameson and you're like, well, that's tomorrow Dave's problem.
Exactly
there's very much a feeling of that here. And I think, look, again, I talked to one AD and I was like, well, doesn't this put you up in a position where you're going to have a very uncertain future in 2030? And he's like, let me tell you something. There's maybe 20, 25 teams in the country who don't have an uncertain future in 2030. Everybody after that should be concerned about what their future looks like. It makes it easier for us to plan for that eventuality if we're not in court every day fighting against ourselves right now. So is that a sound planning strategy? I guess time will tell, but I do think it is a lot about fewer headaches now, and we'll figure out the future when we get there.
To what extent did Florida State, Clemson, North Carolina, Virginia, Miami, take your pick of the teams who are looked at as being in a more upper tier in terms of national desirability, how much did they float themselves to find out their value to others? And did everybody, because we hear this with the NFL draft, that I threw my name out there to see what grade I would get. And it turns out I'm a 5th round pick, so I'm coming back to school. To what extent did they find out their vague value to others?
I think almost everyone, if not everyone. When the lawsuits were first filed, I talked to, I think, every AD in the ACC to find out if they had gone and reviewed the grant of rights to see what their ability to extricate themselves were. And I didn't hear anybody say no. And I've talked to numerous schools who knew, yeah, we're not getting an invite from the SEC, but Big 12 will be happy to have us, and then there's schools that are like, we got some work to do. And it's funny too, because I think timing is a lot of this. And for those of us who are old enough to remember the last big fluctuations in sports back in like 2010, 11, and 12, Georgia Tech was one of the schools that the Big Ten desperately wanted, and they ended up staying in the ACC. Right. And whether they regret that or not is an interesting decision. But Georgia Tech was a get then. Georgia Tech, coming off multiple 3-9 seasons under Jeff Collins, is not a get. And so I think what you see at Georgia Tech is their AD, Jay Batt, who comes from Alabama, is investing in football to try to build things up, knowing, look, there's a ticking clock right here for when all of this might blow up. And we got to be playing good football and be a valuable brand then. Because as I said, there's probably 20, 25 brands in college football that matter so much that they're fine. They have a seat at the table. And there's probably, a dozen, 2 dozen that are sort of at the bottom end of the Power 5, Power 4, whatever it is, that, they're going to be in a hard spot. But like, you go between like 20 and 40, the difference is pretty negligible on that list. And so if you were 40 now, you're 45, and you're probably going to be left out of a future super conference. Well, the difference between being out and being in is a couple of winning seasons in a row, is playing in a playoff game, is having some, Colorado is an out a couple of years ago. Colorado's an in right now, if you're thinking about it in those terms. So I think there's a lot of the ACC in particular who kind of viewed this as like we're borderline undrafted free agents, or maybe we're 5th rounders. And if we can get into the 5th round, that's great for us. So this gives us a window of 5 to 6 years to, get ready for the combine, basically.
Hurry up and get cool. Hurry up and pull a she's all that coming down the stairs. Yeah.
It's funny because as we're talking this through, I'm reminded of that. I don't know where the post was from. It's been making the rounds about the very slight 3% chance that the asteroid hits Earth in the year, whatever, a couple of years down the road.
Yeah.
It feels like 2030 or 31 or 32, somewhere in that window is when all hell could break loose. If you are a betting man, David, I don't know if you are, what does that look like when all this goes crazy? If it goes crazy.
It's funny because I think if you asked 20 different like high level college football people, you might get 20 different answers. I think most people think we're heading towards a contraction at the top level, whatever that looks like. Is it 30 teams, 40 teams, 60 teams? I think that's a little up in the air, and the networks probably play a big part in that. I think a lot of people believe, and I think this at least would be the smart decision, is for football to have its own thing and not have this drag every other sport along with them. And I think you're starting to see that sort of from the other direction, where soccer, for example, is trying to sort of do its own thing and not be so tethered to a amateurism model that doesn't make a lot of sense for them. So, could I see a football breakaway at the top level? I'd say if you're putting odds, I think that's probably the highest odds. Now, is that a majority odds over 50%? Probably not. It's probably maybe like a 1/3 chance, a 25% chance. I don't know. And one of the other things that I keep saying to people, I mean, you guys sort of mentioned this, that sort of just surviving another day gives you another opportunity, because I mean, just think about from the argument over employee status for athletes. 3 months ago, it looked a lot different with Joe Biden and Democrats in power than it does today with Donald Trump and Republicans in power. Well, the political situation locally and nationally is going to change. If you look at, if you're a student of what's going on in higher ed, financially, the economics of higher ed right now, that's shifting a lot. And a lot of these schools are using university money to cover like the rev share money that they have to spend now, that $20.5 million. The courts may have something to say about this with antitrust violations. Like, there's so many hurdles and roadblocks that, like, projecting exactly, like, you can sort of see the trend lines and basic contours of where things are heading. And then it's also entirely possible that they run into a roadblock that turns everything around. And, maybe we're back with a 5 power conferences that are all regional and everybody goes back to the way things were in 2000. I don't see that happening, but I know a lot of people who wouldn't mind seeing it.
By the way, what happens to the old ACC grant of rights now? Because, like, nobody could get to it. It was in a mysterious room. Like, did they just leave it there like it's the lunar module? Like, what happens to that thing?
My assumption is that it is now a placemat at a cookout in Greensboro. But other than that, I have no clue because I don't think it's worth the paper it's printed on anymore.
What, just as you talk to others around college football about this, Dan mentioned, is this going to set a precedent? Is there a sense of relief that there's sort of a stay of execution on more conference realignment? Is it just sort of a continuation of general unease in the sport with so much changing so quickly? What is the, I guess, general sentiment in response to what we've seen here?
Yeah, I think that the first part is correct. There is sort of this like we've been on a treadmill running at 1,000,000
Right.
miles an hour for the last 5 years, basically since COVID started. And if this gives us a chance to catch our breath, like that's a good thing, especially with the House settlement coming and that landscape about to be markedly different than everything that's led up to this. So it's sort of like, get a chance to catch your breath and reevaluate it. It almost sort of reminds me, I think, a little bit of like that like break of like a couple of weeks off and bowl practices between the end of the
Right.
season and a bowl game. It's a chance to go back and figure out all of the like fundamentals you didn't have time when you're on a week to week getting ready for the next game type of thing. It's a reset, but it's not safety by anyone's imagination. Like reset, get your bearings, figure out where you are. Then you got to jump back on that treadmill because it's going to be 2030 before we know it. And again, Texas and Oklahoma, that stuff happened 3 years before their grant of rights was up, and then they had to wait out 2 years of it and then buy out a year. Like the conversations will start again far sooner than any of us are probably eager to have them.
One of the things that you've mentioned, a lot of people have mentioned, is the addition of Stanford, Cal, and SMU actually helped the ACC to buy time, or at least look at itself in a position of safety for longer than it may have been able to had they not joined. What have been the returns sort of emotionally to the additions of Stanford, Cal, and SMU? Are people happy about it because of what it probably means for the future? Are people sort of neutral? Are they displeased with like the weird national element to the conference? What's the vibe check of nationalizing the ACC?
It probably depends on who you ask. I mean, the truth is, I think you guys think back a couple of years ago at the ACC spring meetings, and there was rumblings about a potential breakaway of 7 teams that Brett Murphy brilliantly named the Magnificent Seven, proving once again that if you give something a good nickname, it's 10 times better than it actually is. But that, I think, scared a lot of folks in the ACC. And so one of the advantages that adding those 3 teams did was just make more votes. So it's harder to dissolve the league because there's more teams who will vote not to do it. You look at a place like SMU, this could be going better for SMU and their fan base. Like they made the playoff and just signed their biggest recruiting class they had ever signed. And Rhett Lashley will tell you, like, the number one thing I used to hear on the recruiting trail was, well, you're not Power 5. Well, now we are. And I can answer that question affirmatively. But also, if you're like Cal and Stanford, man, you're taking less money. Now you're about to take even less money. You left a place with absolute uncertainty for another place that has a lot of uncertainty. And I think just in general, like, I mean, as you said, I spend way more time than is healthy thinking about the ACC. And there are days that I'm like, oh, yeah, Stanford. I totally forgot about them.
Yes.
So, it's indicative of the larger issue. The ACC's issues in many ways are a microcosm of everything that's happening in college football. And so I caution people when they want to point and laugh at the ACC. I sort of get it because I've done my share of pointing and laughing over the years for many reasons. But it's very much sometimes they're there, but by the grace of God go I. And you never know when the finger's going to be pointed.
How did Jim Phillips negotiate this? Like, I'm still trying to figure out, how do you go to a school, like we used Boston College before as an example. How do you go to Boston College and say, you're going to take less money and you're going to like it? And I know you said they want to avoid the headaches, and obviously everybody puts a premium on stability. That's still a very awkward conversation to have, is it not?
Yeah, well, it's so funny because a lot of what just passed, the AD Michael Alford at Florida State proposed all of this 2.5 years ago, and it was a non-starter. Like there was not even a conversation about this. Like we weren't going to talk about it, and now here we are. And so how much of that is Jim Phillips? Jim Phillips has been very good at consensus building within the ACC, and that's hard to do. You look at the Big 12, and I mean, it's a lot of public schools who care about football in very similar geographic areas from a demographic standpoint. The ACC is all over the map, like literally and figuratively. And so it has always been really hard to build consensus within this league. And so Jim Phillips, to his credit, has done a great job of that. But I would venture to guess, if you talk to the folks at Boston College, at Wake Forest, at Syracuse, and some of those other places that are probably not benefiting a lot from this, and ask them in their heart of hearts what convinced them, the answer is the Pac-12. Right. The answer is I see Oregon State and Washington State, and I don't.
The cautionary tale, right?
And so there is. Yeah, that's exactly right. And it is. I don't think the timing is coincidental that watching what happened to those two schools and having direct conversations with Stanford and Cal about what they narrowly missed. I think that has been a wake up call for a lot of folks as to, we can't sit back and rest on our laurels and be happy collecting this check anymore.
It's wild. It's like being invited to a wedding. You don't get a +1. It's a cash bar for you. You can only go number 1 in the bathroom. You're going to have to work the valet afterwards, but you can come to the party. You can come to the wedding. And schools in this modern world seem to be like, you know what? It's better than being on the outside looking in.
Yeah. Always better to be at the cool kids table, even if you're at the end of the lunch table, than to be sitting down with the band nerds where I sat in high school, I guess. I don't know.
I'm also trying to figure out how Maryland can accidentally get an ACC check out of all of this. That they're going to be like the Milton collecting, checks from Office Space, even though they're grandfathered in. All right,
the glitch.
We fixed the glitch. Maryland's stopped receiving ACC checks. David Hale, ESPN.com. Thank you so much for explaining all of this to us, the 11-year-olds that we likely are intellectually, and enjoy all things Chapel Hill, I think.
Hey. I'm sure Bill Belichick's going to be excited to chat with me.
Oh my God, he's a personality. That's what he is.
That's right. That's many people are saying.
All right, there you go, Dan. David Hale, first timer, stopping on by at long last from ESPN.com. Probably should have had him on a long time ago. It just didn't work out, but better late than never.
Yes.
Always glad to have a newcomer here on the show, and especially one that can explain all this to us as well as he did.
It is not funny to me, but I guess entertaining to me on a certain level, that the last year or two with regard to this story has been more Florida State than Clemson, but Florida State saying we are big deals and we are not being paid as such. And we are falling behind our co-conspirators in the SEC and the Big Ten as major programs, but we're not making as much money as them. And we are this huge deal in this sport, and we are being underpaid. And then they went 2-10. Now, as we know, record does not determine your value.
Apparently not.
The competitive nature in the short term, as David mentioned, like Georgia Tech, super valuable way back when, string of 3 and 9 seasons, whatever. Like, you are what your eyeballs say you are, I guess, on TV. And a lot of people still watch Florida State. And then to a lesser extent, Clemson, just like the last couple of years of Clemson, even though they didn't fall off like Florida State did this past season, going from, being on the edge of the playoff to once again going 2-10, the last couple of years of Clemson has been sort of fraught with like Dabo melting down at a caller on his radio show. We're just like, again, Clemson, no different than many teams in this sport, that it's a year-to-year thing, and maybe you're not as good as you used to be, and maybe you're having an up year, maybe a down year, whatever. It's just been very entertaining, the teams in the ACC, that like you have Miami people speaking up and then they melt down. You have North Carolina people speaking up. And by the way, the sidebar here is my favorite quote through all of this was some like anonymous North Carolina administrator, trustee, somebody behind the scenes was just like, yeah, we'll just let Florida State and Clemson pay their lawyers and we'll just benefit from whatever's decided. We'll let them pay those fees and we'll just figure out how we fit in after. That they're just sort of drafting from all of this. I enjoyed that. But yeah, there is the insane nature of the ACC these past couple of seasons with the Calgorithm and Stanford joining and upsetting Louisville. And like, I I know you've talked about the Big 12 as like America's most entertaining conference because of all the teams that are sort of jockeying for upper middle class. And I don't necessarily think you're wrong, but the upheaval in the ACC with like the Franimal and Bill O'Brien and Manny Diaz coming in, like SMU coming in, going to the playoff, like it's been chaotically very entertaining to me from afar. You know, to have Cam Ward come in from Pullman, Washington and light this conference on fire in a good way for Miami and might be like the number 1 overall pick after all of this. Like, I've just been very entertained by this whole spectacle. And I hope we get, for me, even if Florida State, whatever, and Clemson, whatever, they leave in 2031 or whatever, I hope that we get the insane nature of the ACC forever, because the idea of a super conference turns my stomach. It absolutely turns my stomach. I know people are pointing to like everything being TV, everything being going in the direction of grouping these 4 teams or whatever together. It turns my stomach. I think it's antithetical to the entire appeal of the sport, and losing Duke and SMU in 6 overtimes, or losing Cam Ward and Miami playing a crazy shootout against, was it Louisville or Duke? Like, I need that forever. I need that drug in my life. I'm hopelessly addicted to, getting TCU Baylor 51-48 and having it be meaningful in a major conference. I need it forever. And the idea that like, well, Florida State is a value add to the Big Ten because they open up a new region and new viewership to watch Florida State, Indiana. It's just revolting to me. It's revolting to me. And let me be clear, Oregon in the Big Ten, still not my thing. It's not my kink. It doesn't get me going. But man, the ACC is its own unique brand of 7-5 versus 8-4 nonsense. And I just hate to lose it personally.
Well, this gets back to the conversation we had months ago at this point, when I forget even the context in which Joel Klatt was discussing this, when he was talking about the big noon games and how it adds value. We don't talk about college football in terms, like you and I don't. Most of the people listening to this show don't talk about college football with their friends in terms of who adds value to the bottom line. Like, no, we don't think of it in terms of that. And nothing highlights that more than a deal like this that is based, as I said earlier, on TV ratings and TV viewership, that type of thing. It just goes to show there are 2 worlds, 2 lenses through which people view this sport. You've got the business executives who are looking at it in terms of, hey, Florida State might be a value add. You've got the rest of us who don't want to see too much upheaval. I'm with you on the Super League thing. I mean, for as much as I think I hold dear the idea of promotion and relegation, just because I've seen the drama that can create.
Yeah.
I don't know if there is a way to do that in college football that doesn't just blow everything up. It doesn't just blow everything up, as you said, as we hold dear.
I think that the biggest argument against promotion and relegation is I don't think that the teams that would annually be at threat for being relegated, I don't think they're going to have the type of fan loyalty that teams in Europe or England or Scotland or wherever happen to have. That they're going to be ride or die for. Who's the team that JJ Watt co-owns? Is that Burnley? Burnley. Like, I know nothing about Burnley. This is a bad example. I imagine the people, and they're in the 2nd tier.
Correct.
I believe. Is that called the Championship?
EFL. Yeah, the Championship.
The Championship. I imagine people at Burnley, there are more people who feel more complicated, passionate emotion about that football club, to use the proper parlance or whatever, than Duke football fans.
Be careful.
I know that there are diehard Duke football fans, but if Duke were relegated, they'd just be like, well, we're going to focus more on basketball, focus more on finding the next Cooper Flag. And so that, I think, is the actual problem, that you're risking losing for a long time a fan base that is going to care and donate money and help support the team.
I don't know. I here's what I want the Verballerhood to weigh in with. truly, this is where I was going with this. Let's say 2030, 2031 comes around.
Mm-hmm.
What is your prediction? I'm not asking you. I'm asking the Verballerhood. What is your prediction for what happens? And I suspect this is opening a Pandora's box to a whole load of sarcastic answers. You can go that direction if you want to. I'm okay with that. But again, anywhere you can leave a comment, be it out on YouTube or Spotify or just out on social media, hit us up on email, solidverbal@gmail.com. We get 1,000 messages every time we put a show out. I would very much welcome what people think happens next, because this was the thing that I was watching. And you know this, I've been talking about Florida State for an eternity, and how it felt to me like Florida State was the next, maybe the last big shoe to fall. The ultimate big shoe to fall is Notre Dame.
Mm-hmm.
But my theory all along has been if Florida State goes, and if suddenly the ACC implodes upon itself, what happens to Notre Dame? That could be the sign for Notre Dame to jump in and get into a conference. And look, if they get the kind of deal that they got when they signed on with the college football playoff, where they don't have to divvy that money out, and they actually ended up getting a pretty good deal after all was said and done.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that changes the calculus a little. But if Florida State leaves, if the ACC becomes untenable, I think that has far-reaching ramifications for schools like Notre Dame and really just the sport as a whole. That's what I am fearful of: Florida State, Clemson leaving, and then boom, everything blows up again. I don't really want to see that.
Right.
That shouldn't stop us from commenting wherever we can. If we're listening to the show, I'm speaking in a very odd tense here. Let us know what your thoughts are on what happens next, because we've got a stay of execution here of about 5 years.
All I can tell you is when you look around, whether it's corporations, whether it's schools, whether it's whatever, there are very few instances of the most advantaged groups or the most advantaged people or the most advantaged corporations who have the most money, who make the most money, saying, we've made enough.
Never happens.
We're doing well enough.
Never happens.
Everybody seems to be doing pretty well here at whatever. And so, let's just be cool. That doesn't seem to be the case in any walk of life all that often.
No.
So to say that Ohio State or Oregon or Alabama or Notre Dame is going to look at the landscape of college football money and say, what could we do to make sure this sport is healthy for the long term versus are we really maximizing shareholder value for Notre Dame, Oregon, Alabama, Penn State, Louisiana State, whatever? All I know is that's generally the direction of the most advantaged corporations and places and entities, that they never seem to feel like they're growing enough, especially as compared to their competitors.
Right.
And so to think that college football will be any different when new TV deals are at the negotiation tables, I think would be pretty silly. Now, he says, holding up a single finger, if you're watching on youtube.com/solidverbal or the solid verbal.
You get at solid verbal or
at
the
solid verbal.
Yeah.
The smartest person in the room will say, why don't we organize the sport in a way that would make the public very happy and trick them into thinking we're going back to the way it used to be, but at the same time, we're also consolidating power. So what I'm saying is Tony Petitti controls the quote-unquote new look Big Ten that happens to feature a 10-team Pacific Division. Something like that. That's what somebody smart will do, that they'll make people think they're going back to what they really want, but at the same time, further consolidating their own power and hopefully giving both parties something that they like. But truly, there's really very little evidence. You hear about maybe Patagonia was one of those companies or something we don't need to expand forever. You hear about those every so often, and maybe I'm wrong about Patagonia, but it's hard to see a universe in which the people atop, for instance, Wisconsin, are saying the Wisconsin Badgers are happy with the amount of money we're making.
Right.
And
Ohio State's not putting sharing is caring up on the on the back of the car. Right. It's just not. It's not the world that we're living in.
it's not the point of, unfortunately, what we're seeing around us in 2025. So
No.
that's, the betting money, if you're so inclined, is on the people that are most advantaged, trying to eke out every single dollar that they can while the getting's good.
Why don't we leave it there, Dan? Again, You can weigh in wherever you can leave a comment on this pod. We'd appreciate it. solidverbal@gmail.com is the email. You can always email us. You can always post to us on social. We read everything. We don't always read it right away, but we do get around to reading it. I promise you. I spend a good chunk of my week doing that. So we will see it. If you've got something to say, we welcome your opinion on the matter. We very much appreciate David Hale's time. He was about to go to a presser with Bill Belichick. So he took time out of his busy day, found a spot, quiet enough spot that he could do the interview with us. We really appreciate his insight. He's done a good job reporting on this story. He does a great job, by the way, every Sunday morning doing his little whip around column. It's like it's essential reading. Essential reading if you're a college football fan. David truly does a really good job covering the sport. And we, again, are grateful that finally got him on the show. Took too long.
You ever, sorry, it was the whole time I was going through that soapbox diatribe of mine. You ever go to a restaurant, like a chain restaurant, and you're like, man, the fries just got so much worse.
Yeah.
Like they switch up an ingredient at, take your pick, at Chili's.
The Burger King fries, man. They killed them.
Right. Or like, man, the Chipotle portions are way down from where they used to be. Or like they changed out the steak and it's tough and gristly. And you ever sit across the table from somebody that says, I hear you, but shareholder value is through the roof at Chipotle. And you're like, Joel Klatt, not now. And it's the saddest thing in the world. Nobody actually says that. But that's what I think about. Like, who would ever feel good about like something that's objectively making your life worse, but it's good for the corporation that the fries are no longer fried in beef tallow or something and taste like garbage? Like, come on, everybody.
Let's leave it there. Thank you to David.
Let's leave it there.
Weigh in. Let us know your thoughts. Hit follow, hit subscribe if you made it this far along. We'll be back next week. 2 new episodes, as always, for that guy over there, my good friend Dan Rubenstein, for myself, Ty Hildebrand. You listen to the Solid Verbal. As always, stay solid.
Peace.